Next, let's look at step 2 of the primary source analysis. Once you have sourced the document, then you're going to think about the elements of bias and how reliable the document actually is. So after historians have thought about where and when and why a document was created, they need to think about what the purpose of it is. For example, is this a personal diary that was intended to keep private, or was it some sort of document like a speech that was prepared for the public? There are all sorts of questions that I've listed here that you're going to want to think about after you have read a document in order to determine exactly how that source is biased. Now, you may be tempted to say, this is a really neutral source, this person doesn't have any clear elements of bias, but that's just never true. Every single source is going to be biased in some way, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It just means that a person's personal life, maybe their race, their class, their ethnicity, their religion, their age, all of those things are influencing the way they think and the way that they write, or what kind of images they draw, or just any kind of primary source that's left behind is going to be influenced by who created that source. So you need to think about all of those elements of bias as you read a primary source. And that doesn't mean that you're going to throw it out and say it's useless if there's a lot of bias to it. You're just going to analyze why that bias is there, and then think about in what way that source may or may not be useful to you as a historian once you've recognized the elements of bias in it. So for this assignment, once you have sourced it, once you have filled in your who, what, where, when, why, and how chart, you're going to just kind of look back at that chart and think about which of those elements are influencing that document. And I've given you a list of questions here that you can think about as you do that. Basically, you just need to write 2 paragraphs assessing the bias and reliability. So think about these questions, think about what you saw in the sourcing chart, and then explain any element of bias that you think the source might contain. So just think about, is there any reason that this person might have wanted to stretch the truth? Do they have any word choices that tell you whether they're trying to be like really objective, or are they trying to persuade you by really using like inflammatory language or something? Is there anything that doesn't really jive with what you know elsewhere that might lead you to believe there's some element of bias? Are they reporting what they saw, or are they telling you what others saw? So think about all of these things and then tell me why the source is biased and in what ways this person is bringing their own personal life to the source. So that's for the first paragraph. And then in a second separate paragraph, answer the question here. If a historian were going to use this source, under what circumstances might it be useful? So think about what kind of research topics it might be helpful for, and then what they might have to be careful about if they're using this source. Or is this source completely useless and no one can ever use it? A little hint, this is almost never going to be the answer. I think that this is so rare that I really just kind of put it in there to play devil's advocate, and you're going to want to answer why, even if it's very biased, the source can still be used in the circumstances that you describe here. So when you look at this part in particular, what kind of research topics would it be helpful for? Let's imagine that you did read that eulogy about Susan B. Anthony's funeral. That would be very useful in a research paper about her life or about the legacy of a famous suffragist. It might not be as useful for a broader topic, like if you just wanted to write about the suffrage movement in general, kind of the broad sweep of it. This may not be the best source. You may find some things, but it might not be the perfect source for that. If you wanted to write about the legacy of black suffragists, Susan B. Anthony was a white suffragist, this may not be the best source for you unless you can find something in there about like her racial attitudes or something like that. And in that case, it would be really good for a paper on, let's say, like comparing white and black suffragists perhaps, but it might not tell you anything about black suffragists themselves, only perhaps her racial attitudes about black suffragists. So that's something to keep in mind. Just think about which questions you actually can use this source to answer. So that's the second paragraph. And here are just a couple of like final things I want you to consider. Remember that it's really hard to find a totally neutral observer. I really don't think there is such a thing. So think about what makes you skeptical about this source, what makes you read it with just a little bit of skepticism, regardless of who the author is, and why you can still use it, but what do you have to be careful about when you're going to use it.